Berlin was seeing a terrible and merciless struggle as the Second World War drew to a finish in Europe. Inside his subterensive bunker, Adolf Hitler stayed as the Soviet Red Army had moved into the heartland of Nazi Germany. He chose to terminate his life while his city was under constant bombing and collapsing under Soviet pressure. Inside the city, the fighting was brutal and severe. It is estimated that the Red Army lost over 80,000 men, but the Germans lost almost 500,000 with roughly 22,000 civilians also dead and almost 500,000 persons arrested. Though the famous pictures of the struggle for the Reichstag linger long in our memory, the Soviet Red Army carried out countless terrible crimes against Berlin's citizens even after defeating the Nazis and forcing the German surrender. Particularly women suffered as the Red Army advanced. Come see us today as we examine the terrible suffering endured by Berlin combat women. Please consider subscription to help our channel. The Soviet artillery fired constantly around Berlin and the city remained seriously hit until its surrender on the April 20, 1945 and Hitler's 56th birthday. During the Battle of Berlin, Soviet artillery was fired in great numbers. The Soviet plan was for encircling the city. 2 days later, Hitler erupted into a blind fit of wrath upon learning that preparations for a German breakout had not come to pass as the city was suffering greatly. It was then when he announced the war was finished and he attributed his generals for this. To try and defend the city, Joseph Goebbels ordered propaganda to keep being distributed. Even young boys were equipped with Panzerfausts and explosives to fight the Soviets. Every German will defend his capital, declared Goebbels hurriedly scrawled white paint on the walls of the houses we visited. We will halt the Red Hordes right at our Berlin's fortifications. Try to stop them as well. Before the tidal wave, steel pillboxes, barricades, mines, traps, suicide squads with grenades held in hand are all thrown aside. Rain started to drizzle from above. Not far from Beisdorf, I observed batteries getting ready for attack. What are the objectives? I inquired of the battery commander. Center of Berlin, Spree bridges, and the Northern and Stedten railway stations, he said. Then arrived the amazing words of command, open fire on the capital of fascist Germany. I recorded the time. Exactly on April 22nd, at 8:30 a.m. Over a few minutes, 96 shells dropped right in Berlin's middle. Reports of the behavior of the Soviet army were returning to Moscow as soon as the Soviets were approaching. Many Germans claimed that Red Army troops attacked all German women staying behind in East Prussia, it was reported. An order number 006 was issued in an effort to channel the emotions of hate toward combat instead of launching assaults, therefore guiding the sentiments of hatred toward the enemy on the battlefield. This had no impact, and the Red Army lacked all sort of discipline inside. The views of the Soviet soldiers on the German invasion gave them in their minds permission to do anything they wanted in Germany, so enabling the appeals to revenge the motherland which the Soviets felt had been violated. One soldier claimed, "Our soldiers' behavior towards Germans, particularly German women, is absolutely correct," and many found it funny what they were doing. It was stated that many Soviet ladies who served inside the Red Army even watched as the soldiers attacked and killed numerous women. It was really disgusting. 1945 saw claims that the Russian soldiers were assaulting every German female from 8 to 80. Many of the Soviet troops drank anything they could get their hands on as well, frequently heavily. This, it is thought, gave them the bravery to attack ladies farther, and many more women suffered abuse at the hands of these intoxicated males. It is thought that 2 million children were born to unwinding German women who had suffered terrible ordeals at the hands of the Red Army forces. They rampaged across Germany attacking and abusing wherever they went. They were totally defenseless. Many older ladies also suffered terrible ordeals and there was no age discrimination. As the Red Army arrived Berlin, many Red Army troops saw women as a right of conquest they could just take almost like sick plunder, and they planned to humiliate the German women as an act of retaliation. One Soviet general reportedly remarked, "A group of 35 provisional lieutenants on a course and their battalion commander entered a women's dormitory, then carried out horrific crimes there." But Joseph Goebbels, who had disseminated propaganda about the terror of the Red Army, had narrated tales of the Red Army soldiers in Berlin. Many thought that despite what had transpired in the countryside, this kind of behavior could not have been carried out inside Berlin. However, the Red Army pillaged the entire city. One man serving close to Berlin summed accurately the Red Army's treatment of women. The captured German female cats declared they were avenging their dead husbands, he said after his squad came upon a group of German women warriors. They have to be exterminated without pity. Although our warriors advised stabbing them, I would just have them executed. Later, as he arrived in Berlin, this same Soviet soldier noticed a group of German women lugging bags and other goods. With dread on their faces, they informed me what had transpired on the first night of the Red Army's arrivals. He then asked where they were headed. They all got on me and prodded here, explaining the gorgeous German chicks. Soviet officials visited a sister, the mother superior of a maternity clinic and orphanage, in one region of Berlin. The women were warned about the second-line soldiers and what they would do by the polite officers. These police were correct. When they got to the residence, mothers who had just given birth, nuns, young ladies, elderly people, pregnant women, and others suffered terrible ordeals. Many of the air raid shelters were discovered by Soviet soldiers as Berlin was falling apart. They then shined their torches in front of many of the women before they were then grabbed out the shelters and they chose their victims. Berlin's women were being treated as war trophies, whose fury and resentment the troops directed. To keep one Soviet soldier safe from other Red Army soldiers, many women were urged to attempt and befriend him. For instance, a Central Asian soldier discovered Magda Wieland, a 24-year-old actress, who had been hiding in a cabinet. If he would shield her from other Russians, she volunteered to be his girlfriend. Instead, he flaunted her to his pals and they subsequently attacked her. Many women had to vanish during what they considered to be the hunting hours, when Soviets would search any lady. Many moms gave their lives to protect their daughters, and they observed the safer hours as the early morning when they were inebriated and sleeping. Many Berlin ladies still today can remember the horror and the screams of those evenings, and as the cannon had blown many of the windows open, everything could be heard. Many Red Army victims were housed in the city's hospitals. One physician thought that roughly 100,000 women had been abused in Berlin, but 10,000 women had perished from their ordeals, or the fact they ended their lives following the atrocities they endured. Red Army troops allegedly abused 2 million women at least all throughout Germany. Men who sought to protect ladies from Soviet invaders were shot dead and executed cruelly. Following the fall of Berlin, onlookers saw that many of Berlin's women sold themselves for food and other pleasures including cigarettes which were being used as currency in the city out of desperation and for sustenance. The next morning, we women proceeded to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible to the Soviets by smearing our faces with coal dust and covering our heads with old rags, our makeup for the Ivan, one lady living during the Battle of Berlin stated. Shaking with panic, we gathered in the middle of the basement. Some peeped through the low cellar windows to see what was happening on the street under Soviet rule. The sight of these fierce and terrifying husky Mongolians froze us. First Soviet orders including a curfew were put at the ruin across the street from us. Outdoors, there was a startling cracking boom. Horrified, we witnessed the Soviets trash the corner grocery shop and toss its contents, shelving and furniture, into the street. Another woman remarked, "The frontline Russian troops who did the fighting as a woman, you didn't have to be afraid of them." The Red Army were wreaking havoc around the city. They left the women alone even though they shot every guy they came across, even small boys and elderly men. The worst were the ones that arrived later, the second echelon. They completed all the pillage and attack. They stripped houses of every last item, down to the toilets inside Berlin. The Soviet Red Army troops generated great fear and panic. They felt they could do what many German troops had done to Soviet women when they rampaged the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, and they believed in retaliation. This, they felt, gave them license to launch massive attacks on the last front line of the European Second World War. What happened to women under the hands of the soldiers traumatized many of them, and many of them struggled to live with their ordeals following the war. Many elderly Berlin women still remember what happened within their city, with the Red Army executing some of the most horrifying and extensive war crimes of the Second World War.